I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
The December wind that swept across the Yorkshire moors on Christmas Eve of 1938 carried more than snow in its bitter embrace. It carried whispered secrets, unspoken confessions, and the weight of sins that even London's most respectable citizens found impossible to bear alone. Whitmore Abbey, a medieval monastery transformed into the country retreat of Lady Constance Ashworth, stood like a grey sentinel against the darkening sky, its Gothic windows glowing with warmth that seemed to mock the relentless cold outside. Lady Constance had conceived her annual Silent Night for the Sinful as both charitable endeavour and moral experiment of the most profound kind. Each Christmas Eve, she invited a carefully selected group of London's elite to participate in what she termed a night of honest reflection and spiritual accounting. The evening's centerpiece was her restored private chapel, where guests were encouraged to write anonymous confessions of their moral failings and consign them to the flames of the sacred brazier, with proceeds from the evening's donations supporting her foundation for fallen women. It was, as she often remarked with characteristic directness, charity that begins with brutal honesty about one's own character. The guest list for this particular evening read like a directory of London's most prominent yet troubled citizens, each carrying burdens that made Lady Constance's invitation both irresistible and terrifying. Sir Reginald Blackwood, the shipping magnate whose recent business dealings had attracted uncomfortable parliamentary scrutiny, sat near the chapel's altar beside his wife, Lady Margaret, whose gambling debts were whispered about in every fashionable drawing-room from Mayfair to Belgravia. Their relationship to their hostess was complicated by the presence of Miss Victoria Blackwood, who served as Lady Constance's private secretary and companion, a position that had afforded her intimate knowledge of both her employer's charitable crusades and her guests' most carefully guarded secrets. Dr. Edmund Carlyle occupied a pew near the chapel's rear, his distinguished medical practice serving half of London's elite, making his presence both valuable and controversial. His recent public statements about the moral obligations of those who profited from others' suffering had cost him several lucrative patients, but earned him Lady Constance's grudging respect. Beside him sat Captain James Morrison, recently returned from service in India, whose distinguished military career had been somewhat tarnished by allegations of conduct unbecoming an officer, charges never proven but sufficient to end his advancement and leave him financially vulnerable. The spiritual guidance for the evening came from two sources that created an interesting theological tension. Father Michael O'Brien, Lady Constance's Irish Catholic advisor and architect of the evening's ceremonial elements, moved quietly among the guests with gentle encouragement toward honest self-examination. His counterpart, the Anglican Reverend Dr. Henry Whitmore, maintained a more reserved presence, his disapproval of the evening's Catholic-influenced rituals evident in his rigid posture and pursed lips, though his own reasons for attendance were as compelling as any other guests'. Quentin Larch, the art dealer whose recent dealings in questionable authentications had attracted unwelcome attention from Scotland Yard, examined the chapel's medieval carvings with the proprietary eye of a man who understood the profitable difference between genuine antiquity and skillful reproduction. His nervous energy contrasted sharply with the military bearing of Colonel Hugh Armitage, whose RAF service record was distinguished, but whose gambling debts had recently forced him into associations that no officer should maintain. As the grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed 11, Lady Constance rose from her position at the chapel's front. She was a woman of 65 whose steel-grey hair and penetrating blue eyes commanded attention without effort, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to moral leadership. "My dear friends," she began, her words echoing softly in the stone chamber, "we gather tonight not in judgment of one another, but in recognition of our shared humanity and our common need for spiritual cleansing. The brazier before you awaits your honest words, and the silence that follows will be our gift to one another." The ceremony proceeded with solemn dignity that would have impressed even the most skeptical observer. One by one, the guests approached the small writing table Lady Constance had positioned near the altar, penned their anonymous confessions on the provided paper, and fed them to the flames with the gravity of ancient ritual. The only sounds were the scratch of pen on paper, the whisper of footsteps on stone, and the soft crackle of burning secrets. Miss Victoria moved discreetly among the guests with the economical competence that had made her invaluable to Lady Constance, ensuring each had what they needed while her dark eyes observed everything with sharp intelligence. It was during this profound silence, as the last confession curled into ash, that disaster struck with shocking suddenness. The chapel lights flickered once, twice, then failed completely, plunging the room into darkness save for the dancing flames of the brazier and the few votive candles that lined the altar. A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembly, followed by Lady Constance's reassuring voice cutting through the darkness. "Please remain seated, my friends. Whitmore Abbey's electrical system has always been temperamental during winter storms." The darkness lasted perhaps 3 minutes. Long enough for someone to move unseen, long enough for evil to find its opportunity in the sacred space. When the lights flickered back to life, the guests found themselves blinking in the sudden brightness, their eyes adjusting to reveal a scene that would forever shatter the peaceful atmosphere of Lady Constance's charitable gathering. Lady Constance herself lay crumpled beside the brazier, her grey silk dress spread around her like the wings of a fallen bird. The ornate brass poker that had been used to tend the sacred fire now lay beside her, its handle bearing the terrible evidence of violence. Her face, turned toward the altar she had served so faithfully, bore an expression not of pain but of profound surprise, as if death had come as an unexpected visitor to her carefully orchestrated evening of moral reflection. Dr. Carlyle was the first to overcome the shock that held the others motionless, his medical training asserting itself in the crisis. His examination was brief but thorough, his conclusion delivered in the flat, professional tone he used to distance himself from personal tragedy. "Lady Constance is dead. The blow to her head was fatal, delivered with considerable force. Death occurred within the last few minutes." Miss Victoria's cry of anguish pierced the chapel's silence, a sound of pure grief that seemed to awaken the others from their stunned paralysis. Captain Morrison immediately took charge, his military bearing asserting itself with battlefield authority. "No one leaves this chapel," he commanded. "The storm has made the roads impassable, and until the authorities arrive, we are all potential suspects in this terrible crime." The weight of this realization settled over the group like a funeral shroud. They were indeed trapped together, by the storm outside, by the circumstances of the crime, and by the terrible knowledge that Lady Constance's killer stood among them, perhaps even now maintaining a facade of shocked innocence while calculating their next move. It was Miss Victoria who, despite her obvious grief, demonstrated the practical intelligence that had made her indispensable to Lady Constance. "There is a telephone in the library," she said, her voice steadying with visible effort. "I shall attempt to reach the constabulary in the village, though I fear the storm may have brought down the lines." As she moved toward the chapel door, Dr. Carlyle cleared his throat with the deliberate sound of a man about to make a crucial suggestion. "Before we summon the local authorities," he said carefully, "perhaps we should consider requesting the assistance of someone with particular expertise in matters of this psychological complexity. I happen to know that Monsieur Hercule Poirot is currently staying at the Moorland Inn, not 5 miles from here. He came to Yorkshire for the restorative properties of the mineral springs, but given our circumstances—" The name hung in the air like an incantation. Even in their shocked state, each person present understood the significance of Dr. Carlyle's suggestion. Hercule Poirot's reputation for solving impossible mysteries had become legendary throughout England, and his methods, relying more on psychological insight than physical evidence, seemed particularly suited to their current predicament. "Yes," Miss Victoria said with sudden determination, her grief transforming into purposeful action. "Send for Monsieur Poirot immediately. If anyone can unravel this terrible mystery, it is he. Lady Constance deserves nothing less than the complete truth, however painful it may prove to be." As the wind howled around Whitmore Abbey and snow continued to fall with relentless persistence, the small group of suspects found themselves trapped not only by the elements, but by the inexorable logic of murder. Somewhere among them walked a killer who had used the sacred darkness of Lady Constance's confession ceremony to commit the most profane of acts. The silent night had indeed become a night for the sinful, but it would take the brilliant mind of Hercule Poirot to determine which among them had crossed the final, unforgivable line from morale failing to mortal sin. The stage was set, the players assembled in their ancient stone theatre, and in the growing darkness outside, a Belgian detective would soon receive a telephone call that would draw him into one of the most psychologically complex cases of his distinguished career. The storm raged on, but within those medieval walls, a different kind of tempest was about to begin, one that would strip away every carefully constructed facade and reveal the human heart in all its capacity for both love and betrayal. Miss Victoria's hands trembled as she lifted the heavy receiver in Lady Constance's mahogany-paneled library, the brass fittings cold against her palm. The telephone line crackled with the fury of the storm, static punctuating each attempt at connection. After several agonizing minutes, she finally reached the village constabulary, Sergeant Davis's gruff Yorkshire accent barely audible through the interference. When she explained the circumstances at Whitmore Abbey, his initial disbelief gave way to grim professionalism. "Murder, you say? At Lady Constance's charity evening?" His voice carried the weight of a man unaccustomed to such gravity in his quiet district. "I'll dispatch men immediately, though the roads are treacherous. Could be hours before we reach you." A pause then. "Did someone mention that Belgian detective fellow? Poirot. He's staying at the Moorland Inn, not 4 miles from the Abbey." "Yes, Sergeant. Dr. Carlyle suggested we request his assistance. Given the complexity of our situation," Miss Victoria's voice steadied as she spoke, drawing strength from purpose. "Right then. I'll telephone the inn directly. If Monsieur Poirot agrees to come, he'll likely arrive before my men can navigate these roads." The call to the Moorland Inn proved fortuitous. Hercule Poirot, who had been enjoying a precisely prepared tisane by his window, received the message with characteristic composure. The innkeeper's description of the emergency at Whitmore Abbey presented exactly the sort of psychological puzzle that engaged his interest. Within 30 minutes, he had dressed with meticulous care and arranged transport with the inn's most experienced driver. The journey through the blizzard tested both man and machine, but Thomas, the inn's sturdy driver, knew every curve of the moorland roads. The motor car's headlamps carved through the swirling snow like desperate beacons, and despite the treacherous conditions, they reached Whitmore Abbey as the grandfather clock chimed midnight. Poirot emerged from the vehicle with unhurried precision, his small figure bundled in a thick overcoat, every flake of snow methodically brushed from his shoulders before he approached the Abbey's entrance. Miss Victoria met him at the door, her relief evident despite her composed demeanor. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming. I am Victoria Blackwood, Lady Constance's secretary. The circumstances are most distressing. Mademoiselle, I offer my condolences. Now, if you please, we will proceed with method. Nothing must be disturbed until I have observed." Captain Morrison, still maintaining his self-appointed guard duty, led them to the chapel. The scene remained exactly as discovered, Lady Constance's form lying beside the brazier, the brass poker positioned nearby. Poirot paused at the threshold, his keen eyes absorbing every detail before he stepped forward. "Très bien. Dr. Carlyle, you examined the victim. You will confirm that nothing has been moved." "Nothing, Monsieur Poirot. I was most careful to preserve the scene." Poirot nodded approvingly, then approached the body with deliberate steps. He knelt briefly, observing the angle of Lady Constance's head and the nature of her wound without touching anything. Rising, he examined the brass poker through his handkerchief, noting its position relative to the victim. The blow was precise, delivered with knowledge of anatomy. This was not a crime of passion, but of calculation. His gaze swept the chapel, taking in the arrangement of pews, the brazier's position, and the writing table near the altar. Now we must establish the movements during the crucial period. Each of you will tell me exactly where you sat when the lights failed, and whether you moved. The suspects arranged themselves in a semicircle before him. Sir Reginald claimed the second pew on the right aisle, his wife beside him. Dr. Carlyle had occupied the rear pew near the door. Father O'Brien indicated the left aisle, 3 rows from the front, while Reverend Whitmore had sat opposite him. Captain Morrison admitted to half rising when darkness fell, and Miss Victoria confirmed she had been at the writing table, tending to supplies. "The duration of darkness?" Poirot inquired, his tone suggesting the answer held particular significance. 3 minutes, perhaps slightly more, Dr. Carlyle offered. "Precisely 3 minutes," Captain Morrison corrected, then added uncertainly, "approximately." Poirot moved to examine the writing table, his handkerchief-protected finger tracing its edge. He peered into the brazier, noting the ash and a single fragment of paper bearing an embossed stationer's mark. With an almost imperceptible motion, he closed the brazier's lid. "There has been much confession tonight," he murmured. "Most fatiguing for some, I imagine. Tell me, who tends to the electrical arrangements in this house?" "The caretaker, but the storm prevented his attendance," Miss Victoria replied. "Father O'Brien and I checked the fuses before the ceremony." "Ah, yes, we shall examine this electrical board together. But first, I observe that someone was not where they claim to have been, and that they understood the darkness better than the others." His eyes swept the assembled faces, each now touched with apprehension. "We will proceed with patience, mes amis. Already it becomes most instructive." Poirot's methodical examination of the electrical panel revealed more than simple mechanical failure. Located in a narrow utility room adjacent to the chapel, the metal cabinet stood slightly ajar, its brass fittings dulled by years of Yorkshire dampness. Miss Victoria produced her keys with steady hands, though Poirot observed the slight tremor that betrayed her composure. "You examined this system earlier this evening?" Poirot inquired, his handkerchief-protected finger tracing the main switch without touching the metal directly. "Father O'Brien and I checked every connection before the ceremony," Miss Victoria confirmed. "Lady Constance was particular about such details. The system was functioning perfectly." Poirot's keen eyes noted the telltale scratches around the main switch, fresh marks that caught the dim light. More significantly, a faint smudge of soot marked the metal where a thumb might have pressed, and the switch itself showed signs of recent manipulation. "This was no accident of weather, mademoiselle. Someone deliberately plunged the chapel into darkness, someone who understood precisely which lever controlled those lights." The implications hung between them like a physical presence. Miss Victoria's face paled as she grasped the meaning. But that would require intimate knowledge of the Abbey's electrical arrangements. Only Lady Constance, myself, and perhaps the caretaker would possess such information. Précisément. And yet our caretaker was prevented by the storm from attending. Poirot closed the cabinet with deliberate care. We must also consider that someone among our gathering obtained this knowledge through careful observation or previous opportunity. Returning to the chapel, Poirot noted the passage door that connected the utility area to the chancel. When tested, it opened with a low groan, not loud but distinct in the hushed atmosphere. "Someone could have moved unseen during the darkness," he murmured, approaching Lady Constance from behind while the others remained in their pews. The assembled suspects waited with varying degrees of composure. Captain Morrison maintained his military bearing, though his eyes darted frequently toward the chapel entrance. Sir Reginald's usual commanding presence had diminished considerably, replaced by the nervous energy of a man unaccustomed to scrutiny. Dr. Carlyle sat with professional detachment, yet his hands betrayed subtle tremors. "We shall now conduct individual interviews," Poirot announced. "Each person will speak privately with me while Captain Morrison maintains watch over the others. We begin with Sir Reginald, if you please." In Lady Constance's private study, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the lingering scent of lavender, Sir Reginald's composure finally cracked under Poirot's gentle but persistent questioning. The shipping magnate's hands worked nervously at his watch chain as he revealed the source of his afternoon confrontation with their hostess. "She discovered irregularities in my shipping contracts with her foundation," Sir Reginald admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Overcharging for transportation, false manifests, inflated costs. It wasn't malicious, you understand, merely opportunistic business practices." "And Lady Constance's response to these discoveries?" "She demanded immediate restitution and threatened public exposure if I refused. The scandal would have destroyed not only my business but my reputation entirely." Sir Reginald's shoulders sagged with the weight of confession. "But I didn't kill her, Monsieur Poirot. I was prepared to pay, to make amends." Dr. Carlyle's interview proved equally revealing. The distinguished physician's recent public statements about moral obligations had been prompted by Lady Constance's investigation into his selective patient treatments. She had discovered his practice of providing expensive procedures to wealthy clients while referring the poor to inadequate alternatives, pocketing substantial profits through arrangements with private clinics. "She gave me an ultimatum," Dr. Carlyle confessed, his professional demeanor finally showing cracks. "Reform my practices immediately or face public exposure." She had documented everything, Monsieur Poirot. Patient records, financial transactions, correspondence with the clinics. Her thoroughness was remarkable and terrifying. As each interview concluded, a disturbing pattern emerged. Lady Constance had not been conducting a simple charity evening but orchestrating a complex moral reckoning. Her silent night for the sinful had been designed to force confessions from individuals she had already investigated and found wanting. Each guest possessed not only motive for murder, but desperate reasons to silence their hostess permanently. The wind continued its mournful howling outside Whitmore Abbey, but within the ancient walls, Poirot's methodical investigation was beginning to illuminate the darkness that had concealed a killer's movements. The electrical tampering, the passage door, and the mounting revelations of scandal and blackmail were forming a picture of premeditated murder, executed with cold calculation during those crucial 3 minutes of darkness. Yet questions remained. Who among the suspects possessed the necessary knowledge and opportunity, and what final secret had driven someone to cross the line from moral failing to mortal sin? Lady Margaret entered the study next, her usual aristocratic composure betraying subtle cracks under the weight of circumstance. Poirot observed how her jeweled fingers worked nervously at her silk gloves as she settled into the offered chair, her gaze avoiding his penetrating stare. "Madame, your husband has been most forthcoming about his business difficulties with Lady Constance. Perhaps you might enlighten me regarding your own relationship with our hostess?" The question struck its mark with precision. Lady Margaret's carefully maintained facade crumbled as she revealed the extent of her gambling debts, and Lady Constance's meticulous documentation of every wager, every forged signature on household accounts, every desperate attempt to conceal mounting losses from her husband. She knew everything, Monsieur Poirot. The jewelry I'd sold, the household silver I'd pawned, even the servants' wages I'd appropriated to cover my debts at the gaming tables. But worse still, she'd discovered that some of Reginald's irregular business practices were inadvertently funding my gambling. We were both trapped in her web of moral accounting. Lady Margaret's voice trembled with a mixture of shame and resentment. She demanded complete restitution and threatened to expose everything to Reginald if I refused to submit to her program of moral reformation. Captain Morrison's military bearing remained intact as he entered, though Poirot detected the subtle tension in his jaw and the way his hands rested too precisely on his knees. The decorated officer's fall from grace had been precipitated by Lady Constance's investigation into a colonial incident in India involving military supply contracts and allegations of financial impropriety. She claimed to possess new evidence, Monsieur Poirot, letters from a disgruntled clerk, ledgers detailing discrepancies in supply transactions, documents that could have resulted in court-martial proceedings, even years after the official exoneration. Captain Morrison's voice carried the controlled precision of military training, but underneath lay barely suppressed fury. She gave me until the new year to confess publicly and surrender my military honors voluntarily or face complete exposure and ruin. When asked about his movement during the darkness, Morrison's response was characteristically precise. I half rose when the lights failed, intending to secure the room. However, I remained essentially stationary, using this to maintain awareness of time. He drew back his cuff slightly, revealing a watch with a luminous dial. A habit from India, Monsieur Poirot. One learns to account for time even in confusion. Father O'Brien's interview proved the most emotionally charged. The Irish priest's usual composure dissolved as he revealed Lady Constance's investigation into missing parish funds and his gambling addiction. His hands shook as he described how she had documented every missing shilling, every creative interpretation of church accounting he had employed to cover his debts. She was like a confessor who demanded earthly penance as well as spiritual, Monsieur Poirot. Complete restitution within 6 months, public acknowledgement of my failings to the parish, and voluntary exile to a monastery in Ireland. The shame would have destroyed my ministry entirely. Father O'Brien's voice cracked with genuine anguish, yet Poirot noted that the priest possessed intimate knowledge of the abbey's layout and had helped check the electrical system earlier that evening. Reverend Whitmore's interview was brief but revealing. The Anglican cleric's disapproval of the evening's ceremonies masked deeper concerns about Lady Constance's investigation into his embezzlement of church restoration funds and sale of valuable historical artifacts from parish collections. His rigid demeanor cracked as he admitted that her evidence would have resulted in defrocking and criminal prosecution. Miss Victoria's interview concluded the series, and it was she who led Poirot to the most significant discovery of the evening. With trembling hands, she unlocked the small drawer in the vestry desk behind the chapel, revealing its empty interior. Lady Constance had prepared sealed envelopes for each guest, Miss Victoria explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Instructions to be dispatched in the morning if certain undertakings were not met. I typed some of the covering letters at her dictation, but she handled the final arrangements herself. The envelopes were here just before the ceremony began. Poirot examined the empty drawer with characteristic thoroughness, noting the absence of any signs of forced entry. When he announced the missing papers to the assembled group, the revelation worked upon them like acid on metal. Captain Morrison immediately declared that murder and theft were of one piece, suggesting that whoever feared those papers had killed to prevent their dispatch and stolen them to ensure permanent silence. Dr. Carlyle sprang to his feet in outrage when Morrison's logic seemed to point toward medical knowledge being required for the precise, fatal blow. The mounting tension in the chapel was palpable as each suspect realized that the killer had not only silenced Lady Constance but had also secured the evidence that could have destroyed them all. Yet Poirot's calm observation that appearances were often the most artful of liars suggested that the path to truth would require more than convenient conclusions based on obvious motives and missing evidence. The revelation of the missing envelope struck the assembled group like a physical blow, transforming their earlier shock into something far more dangerous. Dr. Carlyle's face had gone ashen, his medical composure finally cracking under the weight of implication. Captain Morrison's suggestion that murder and theft were of one piece resonated through the chapel with terrible logic, and suddenly every eye turned toward the distinguished physician who possessed both the anatomical knowledge to deliver such a precise, fatal blow and desperate reasons to prevent those papers from reaching their intended destinations. "This is preposterous," Dr. Carlyle protested, his voice carrying the strain of a man fighting for his reputation. "Yes, I had motives, as did everyone present. But to suggest that my medical knowledge makes me uniquely capable of murder is both insulting and illogical." Poirot observed this exchange with the detached interest of a scientist studying specimens under glass. He raised one small, perfectly manicured hand, and the rising voices subsided as if he had cast a spell over the assembly. "Mes amis, we shall not determine guilt through indignation or convenient logic. We shall determine it through method, through the careful observation of what is, rather than what appears to be." Moving with deliberate precision, Poirot directed each person to return to their exact position during the crucial 3 minutes of darkness. Miss Victoria took her place at the writing table near the altar, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged the remaining confession papers. Captain Morrison positioned himself in the aisle where he claimed to have half risen, his military bearing intact despite the circumstances. Sir Reginald and Lady Margaret returned to their pew, their usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of scrutiny. Father O'Brien settled into his seat on the left side, 3 rows from the front, while Reverend Whitmore took his position opposite. Dr. Carlyle, now the focus of suspicious glances, reluctantly occupied the rear pew near the door. "Captain Morrison, your watch, if you please," Poirot requested with characteristic politeness. The military man extended his wrist, revealing a timepiece with a luminous dial that glowed faintly in the chapel's subdued lighting. "Excellent. We shall now reconstruct those crucial moments, but with method rather than confusion." Poirot positioned himself midway down the aisle, his head tilted slightly as if listening to the very stones of the ancient abbey. "Mademoiselle Victoria, you will extinguish the lights at my instruction and restore them when I call out. We shall observe what the darkness teaches us about movement and opportunity." When the lights failed at Poirot's command, the chapel plunged into the same velvet blackness that had concealed murder. The wind continued its mournful song against the windows, the brazier crackled softly, and from somewhere in the old timbers came the faint groaning of wood settling under winter's weight. Poirot closed his eyes, allowing sound rather than sight to map the space around him. "Each of you will now walk, in turn, from your position to the brazier and return," he instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do not touch anything. I wish to learn what movement sounds like in darkness." Captain Morrison moved first, his disciplined tread marking each step with military precision. The soft scrape of leather on stone counted out his paces with mechanical regularity. When the lights returned, Poirot nodded approvingly. Sir Reginald's heavier step betrayed uncertainty in the darkness. He stumbled against a pew end and muttered an apology that seemed to echo his general discomfort with the evening's proceedings. Lady Margaret's progress produced 2 distinct taps of her heel against wood, her fashionable shoes ill-suited for silent movement. Father O'Brien moved with surprising sureness, his familiarity with the chapel's layout evident in his confident navigation. Reverend Whitmore took considerably longer, colliding audibly with a kneeler and muttering under his breath about the propriety of such exercises. Dr. Carlyle, despite his protests of unfamiliarity with the Abbey's layout, moved with an economy of motion that suggested careful spatial awareness. Most intriguing was Miss Victoria's movement from the writing table to the brazier. Her progress produced scarcely a sound beyond the faint whisper of silk against stone, her familiarity with every inch of the chapel evident in her silent navigation. When this exercise concluded, Poirot moved to examine the chancel door that connected to the utility passage. Opening it slowly, the hinge produced its characteristic groan. "Did anyone hear this sound during the actual darkness?" he inquired. Heads shook in negative response. "Très bien. This tells us that our killer had no need to use the passage. The electrical manipulation was accomplished from within the chapel itself. Returning to the brazier, Poirot employed his handkerchief to carefully examine the accumulated ash. With the delicacy of an archaeologist uncovering ancient treasures, he extracted several fragments of partially burned paper. Most were the expected remains of the evening's confessions, but among them lay something different, darker curls of material that had melted rather than burned cleanly. "Sealing wax," he announced with quiet satisfaction. "Someone has indeed burned additional documents tonight, documents sealed with wax rather than simply written confessions." He held up a fragment bearing traces of an embossed watermark. "This is expensive stationery, the type used for formal correspondence." Miss Victoria stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "That's Lady Constance's personal writing paper. She used it for all her important letters." The implications settled over the group like morning frost. Someone had used the sacred brazier not only as cover for murder, but as a means of destroying evidence, burning Lady Constance's carefully prepared documentation, while the confusion of darkness provided perfect concealment. Captain Morrison's voice carried the ring of military certainty. "The evidence points clearly to someone with medical knowledge, someone who understood exactly how to deliver a fatal blow and had the presence of mind to destroy the evidence immediately afterward." Dr. Carlyle's composure finally shattered completely. "You're determined to make me your scapegoat. Yes, I had knowledge and motive, but so did others here. This rush to judgment serves only to protect the real killer." The tension in the chapel had reached a breaking point, with accusations flying and defensive protests growing more desperate. Yet Poirot remained calm, his keen eyes observing not just the obvious evidence, but the subtle reactions, the small inconsistencies of behavior that spoke more eloquently than words. "It is most interesting," he said finally, his tone carrying neither judgment nor comfort. "The solution appears so clear, so logical, so satisfying to our desire for swift justice. Yet I have learned, mes amis, that when a solution appears too perfect, too convenient, it is often because we are seeing only what someone wishes us to see." His gaze swept the assembled faces, noting the mixture of relief and apprehension his words produced. "The storm continues, and we remain isolated together until morning. This provides us with an advantage our killer did not anticipate. Time to observe, to question, to discover the truth that lies beneath the surface of apparent certainty." The wind outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself were conspiring to maintain their imprisonment. Within the chapel, 6 suspects waited with growing unease as Hercule Poirot prepared to demonstrate that the most obvious solution was rarely the correct one, and that the human heart harbored secrets far more complex than simple guilt or innocence. Poirot's declaration that the obvious solution might be deliberately constructed hung in the chapel air like incense, permeating every corner with its unsettling implications. The assembled suspects shifted uneasily in their positions, each wrestling with the possibility that their collective suspicion of Dr. Carlyle had been orchestrated by someone far more cunning than they had imagined. "You speak as if one among us is a master manipulator," Sir Reginald said, his voice carrying a tremor that betrayed his growing unease. "But we are all victims of circumstance here, trapped by the storm and by this terrible crime." "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, mon ami," Poirot replied with gentle firmness. "One among you is indeed a victim of circumstance, but not in the way you imagine. Someone has been most carefully preparing for this evening, anticipating every detail, every reaction, every convenient conclusion that would follow. Lady Constance's death." With characteristic precision, Poirot requested their gloves, the simple command carrying unexpected weight. One by one they produced them, Lady Margaret's pale silk gloves, Sir Reginald's substantial leather pair showing a faint dark smear on the right thumb, Father O'Brien's serviceable black gloves, Captain Morrison's regulation pair, Dr. Carlyle's fine leather gloves, and Miss Victoria's neat kid gloves, unmarked and pristine. Poirot examined each with his handkerchief, his keen eyes noting not just the gloves themselves but the hands that wore them, particularly Sir Reginald's heavy gold signet ring bearing a fresh nick on its bezel. "It is fascinating, is it not?" Poirot continued, returning the gloves without comment. "How the human mind seeks patterns, seeks the most direct route to explanation. A doctor, a precise blow, missing documents, the pieces fit together so neatly, n'est-ce pas? Almost too neatly. But life, and especially crime, is rarely a simple equation." Moving to examine the brass poker's usual position beside the brazier, Poirot addressed Captain Morrison directly. "Your military training has made you observant of details others might miss. During the ceremony, before the darkness fell, did you notice anything unusual about the positioning of objects near the altar?" Morrison's response was immediate and precise. "The poker had been moved approximately 6 inches from its usual position. I noticed because it caught the light differently than during previous visits to the Abbey." This observation sent a ripple of unease through the group. If the poker had been deliberately repositioned before the ceremony began, it suggested premeditation of a chilling degree. Someone had been planning murder while participating in Lady Constance's ritual of moral cleansing. "Mademoiselle Victoria," Poirot continued, "you saw Lady Constance's face just after the lights returned. What was her expression?" Miss Victoria closed her eyes, recalling the terrible image. "Surprise, Monsieur Poirot. Not pain, not terror, but a profound, almost bewildered surprise, as if she had not expected her attacker." "Précisément," Poirot affirmed, his eyes gleaming with sudden insight. "Surprise. This detail is of the utmost significance. If she had been attacked by someone she feared, would not her expression have been one of terror? But surprise suggests the attacker was someone she trusted, someone whose approach she had no reason to dread." The simple logic of Dr. Carlyle as the obvious culprit began to unravel, replaced by the more complex possibility that the killer was someone whose presence Lady Constance would not have perceived as threatening. Poirot then made a brief expedition to Lady Constance's private study, accompanied by Miss Victoria and Captain Morrison. In the austere room, dominated by a photograph of a younger Lady Constance with 12-year-old Victoria, they discovered a small dispatch box on the table by the window. The lock showed fresh scratches, evidence of recent tampering, though the box remained secure. "The summary document you mentioned, mademoiselle, Lady Constance's personal record of tonight's arrangements. It would have been kept here." "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. She always prepared such summaries, sealed and addressed to herself to be opened if she felt tempted to show mercy where justice demanded firmness." Returning to the chapel, Poirot employed his handkerchief to extract one final fragment from the brazier's ashes. This piece was different, thicker, bearing traces of official letterhead. When held to the light, faint text became visible. "Criminal prosecution and immediate action required." Miss Victoria gasped in recognition. "That's from correspondence with the constabulary. Lady Constance had been preparing formal complaints, not just moral ultimatums." The revelation struck like a physical blow. Lady Constance had not been conducting simple moral guidance, but preparing for legal action that would have resulted in criminal charges, imprisonment, and complete ruination for her targets. The stakes had been far higher than anyone realized. Dr. Carlyle's face went white. "She was planning to have us all arrested. This wasn't charity, it was entrapment, gathering final confessions before she destroyed us all." "And yet," Poirot observed quietly, "someone among you knew this, anticipated this, and acted to prevent it. Someone who understood that tonight was not about redemption, but about justice of the most final kind. The question remains, who possessed both the knowledge and the desperation to commit murder rather than face the consequences of their actions?" The chapel fell silent except for the wind's diminishing howl. In that silence, Hercule Poirot prepared to demonstrate that even the most carefully orchestrated deception contained within it the seeds of its own revelation, and that the human heart, under sufficient pressure, would always betray its deepest secrets. The weight of Lady Constance's planned criminal prosecutions settled over the chapel like a funeral shroud, transforming what had seemed like moral reformation into something far more sinister. Poirot observed the subtle shifts in each suspect's demeanor with the keen attention of a naturalist studying specimens under pressure. Dr. Carlyle's hands trembled as he absorbed the full implications of his situation, while Father O'Brien crossed himself repeatedly, his lips moving in silent prayer. Lady Margaret's aristocratic composure had cracked entirely, tears streaming silently down her powdered cheeks. The criminal complaints were prepared with meticulous precision, Miss Victoria confirmed, her voice steadying despite her obvious distress. Lady Constance always acted on Boxing Day, believing Christmas should be reserved for reflection rather than consequences. Everything was ready for dispatch tomorrow morning. Poirot nodded, thoughtfully, then made an unexpected request. "If you would be so kind, I should like to examine each person's gloves once more, but this time with particular attention to detail." The simple command carried unexpected weight, and one by one they produced their gloves again. This time, Poirot's examination was more thorough, using his handkerchief to protect his fingers as he studied not just the gloves themselves, but the hands that wore them. Sir Reginald's substantial leather gloves showed a faint dark smear on the right thumb, and his heavy gold signet ring bore a fresh nick on its bezel that caught the chapel's subdued lighting. When Poirot requested to examine the dispatch box once more, the comparison proved illuminating. The scratches around the lock corresponded roughly to the damaged ring, though not perfectly. "I attempted to open it," Sir Reginald confessed, his usual commanding presence deflating like a punctured balloon. "Earlier this evening, while the guests were gathering, I knew she kept papers about all of us, and I thought perhaps I could—" His voice trailed off in shame. "It was foolish. I couldn't manage it, and I abandoned the attempt when I heard footsteps in the corridor." "And yet," Poirot observed with characteristic gentleness, "your glove bears traces of red sealing wax, not merely the soot one might expect from warming one's hands at the brazier. This suggests contact with sealed documents, does it not?" The observation sent a ripple of unease through the assembled group. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his military bearing reasserting itself. "Then we have our answer. Reginald attempted the box, failed, then took advantage of the darkness to murder Lady Constance and burn the evidence in the brazier." "Ah, but that is where the psychology becomes most interesting," Poirot replied, his tone suggesting deeper complexities. "Consider Lady Constance's final expression, which Mademoiselle Victoria so accurately described as one of profound surprise. Had she been attacked by Sir Reginald, a man with whom she had engaged in heated confrontation that very day, would not her expression have been one of fear or defensive anger? But surprise suggests an attack from an unexpected quarter, from someone whose approach she had no reason to dread." Moving to the writing table where Miss Victoria had been stationed during the ceremony, Poirot examined the remaining confession papers with renewed interest. Among the blank sheets, he discovered one bearing the faint impression of writing, the ghost of words pressed through from a sheet above. Using the side of a pencil with archaeological delicacy, he carefully revealed the hidden text. The words that emerged made Miss Victoria gasp audibly. "The burden of secrets becomes unbearable when love and duty conflict." The handwriting was Lady Constance's own, written with the careful precision she brought to all her correspondence. This was not a confession intended for the brazier, Poirot observed quietly. This was a personal note, perhaps part of a letter or diary entry. It speaks to an internal struggle, a conflict between affection and moral obligation that troubled our hostess deeply. Miss Victoria's face had gone pale, and Poirot noted how her hands trembled as she processed the implications of the discovered text. Lady Constance was not merely conducting moral guidance, she whispered. She was wrestling with her own conscience about something far more personal than the crimes of her guests. The revelation cast the evening's events in an entirely different light. Lady Constance had not been a detached moral arbiter, but someone torn between love and justice, someone whose own secrets might have been as devastating as those she sought to expose in others. The burned documents in the brazier, Poirot continued, his voice carrying the weight of dawning understanding, included not only the stolen envelopes containing threats to our assembled guests, but also Lady Constance's personal correspondence. Someone destroyed evidence of their own crimes, yes, but they also destroyed evidence of Lady Constance's internal struggle, her private thoughts about a situation that caused her profound moral anguish. Father O'Brien's voice carried a note of growing comprehension. You're suggesting that Lady Constance herself was protecting someone, that her moral crusade was complicated by personal feelings that conflicted with her sense of justice. I suggest that the human heart is rarely as simple as we wish it to be, Poirot replied. Someone among you was not merely a target of Lady Constance's investigation, but also the object of her deepest affection, someone whose exposure would have caused her as much pain as it would have caused them. This person understood that Lady Constance's sense of duty would eventually overcome her personal feelings, and they acted to prevent that terrible choice from being made. The chapel fell silent except for the diminishing wind outside. In that silence, Hercule Poirot prepared to demonstrate that the most complex murders often arose not from simple greed or fear, but from the twisted psychology of love corrupted by desperation, where the very depth of affection became the motive for the most unthinkable betrayal. The concept of love twisted into betrayal settled over the chapel like a shroud, transforming the investigation from a simple matter of criminal exposure into something far more psychologically complex. Poirot observed how each suspect processed this revelation, noting particularly how Miss Victoria's composed demeanor had begun to show subtle cracks, her hands working nervously at the fabric of her dark dress as the implications of Lady Constance's internal struggle became clear. The detective's methodical examination of the scene had revealed more than simple murder and theft. Moving with characteristic precision, he requested that Captain Morrison accompany him on a brief inspection of the Abbey's other rooms, leaving the remaining suspects under strict instruction to remain in the chapel. Their destination was Lady Constance's private study, where the lingering scent of recent smoke drew them like a beacon. The discovery that awaited them transformed the entire complexion of the crime. Lady Constance's dispatch box, which had been securely locked in her study, now lay as a twisted ruin in the fireplace grate. The brass corners glowed dully among the coals, while fragments of important papers curled into ash. Someone had committed a second crime, destroying the remaining evidence with desperate haste while Poirot had been conducting his interviews. Using fireplace tongs with surgical precision, Poirot extracted several fragments that had escaped complete destruction. One piece bore the unmistakable watermark of expensive stationery, while another showed traces of official letterhead with the partially visible words, "Criminal Prosecution." Most significantly, a small fragment revealed Lady Constance's penciled notation, "V. Urgent Box, Boxing Day." The destruction was recent, Poirot observed, noting how the metal fittings still retained heat. Someone used the confusion of our investigation to eliminate the final pieces of evidence. But haste, mon ami, is the enemy of thoroughness. Always, the criminal leaves something behind. Returning to the chapel, Poirot announced the discovery with characteristic understatement. It appears we have had a second crime committed under our very noses. Someone has destroyed Lady Constance's dispatch box and its contents, using fire to eliminate what the first crime failed to secure. The revelation struck the assembled group like a physical blow. Miss Victoria's face went pale, and Poirot noted with interest how she instinctively glanced toward her hands before quickly folding them in her lap. When he requested to examine everyone's hands for signs of recent contact with heat or soot, the inspection revealed a telling detail, a fresh reddening at the base of Miss Victoria's right thumb, the precise type of burn that resulted from hasty contact with heated metal or sealing wax. A small injury, Poirot observed gently, but most instructive. The pattern suggests contact with something specific, perhaps the heated corner of a brass fitting or the melted wax from official seals being fed to flames. Miss Victoria's explanation came quickly, perhaps too quickly. I smelled smoke and went to investigate. When I saw the glow under the study door, I tried to salvage what I could, but the heat was too intense. I barely managed to pull back before being burned more severely. But that presents an interesting contradiction, Poirot replied, his tone remaining conversational despite the weight of his words. Captain Morrison and I found the study door unlocked, yet you possess the only key besides Lady Constance herself. If you were merely investigating, smoke? How did you gain entry to attempt this rescue? The question hung in the air like incense, permeating every corner of the chapel with its implications. Poirot then directed their attention to a technical detail that had been troubling him since his initial examination of the electrical system. Moving to the chancel rail, he ran his handkerchief-protected finger along its polished surface until he located a small brass button, cunningly concealed among the decorative elements. The electrical system of Whitmore Abbey possesses certain peculiarities, he explained. This button, installed for ceremonial purposes, controls the chapel lighting independently of the main system. Someone with intimate knowledge of the Abbey's arrangements could have manipulated the lights without leaving their position near the altar, creating darkness while appearing to remain stationary among the other guests. The technical revelation cast Miss Victoria's position during the crucial moments in an entirely new light. As Lady Constance's secretary and companion, she possessed unparalleled knowledge of every mechanical detail of the Abbey's operation. Her familiarity with the building's quirks and systems would have made such manipulation not only possible, but relatively simple to execute. Father O'Brien crossed himself, his voice barely above a whisper. The person we seek was not just present during the ceremony, but was integral to its very organization. Someone who knew every detail, every possibility, every weakness that could be exploited. Poirot nodded gravely, his keen eyes noting how Miss Victoria's composed facade was beginning to crumble under the weight of accumulating evidence. The psychological pressure was building systematically, each revelation adding another stone to the wall of proof that would eventually make denial impossible. "We are approaching the truth, mes amis," he announced quietly. "The human heart, under sufficient pressure, cannot long maintain deception. Soon all will be revealed, and justice will finally be served for Lady Constance, who deserved far better than betrayal from those she trusted most completely." The wind outside had begun to subside, but within the chapel, the storm of revelation was just beginning to reach its full intensity. The psychological pressure that had been building throughout Poirot's methodical investigation had reached a crescendo, and Miss Victoria's carefully constructed facade was beginning to show irreparable cracks. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her dark dress, a nervous gesture that had become increasingly frequent as each piece of evidence found its place in the detective's inexorable reconstruction of the crime. Poirot observed these subtle manifestations of guilt with the detached interest of a scientist studying a specimen under pressure. The burn mark on her thumb, her intimate knowledge of the Abbey's systems, her position during the crucial moments, and most damning of all, the psychological evidence of Lady Constance's internal struggle, all pointed toward a conclusion that grew more undeniable with each passing moment. "The human heart," Poirot began, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had broken so many criminals before, "is capable of extraordinary contradictions. It can harbor the deepest love alongside the most desperate fear, and sometimes these emotions become so entangled that only the most extreme action seems capable of cutting through the knot they have created." He moved with deliberate precision to Lady Constance's private study, returning with a leather portfolio that he placed carefully on the altar. The simple action drew every eye in the chapel, and Poirot noted with particular interest how Miss Victoria's gaze fixed upon the portfolio with an intensity that spoke of recognition and desperate concern. Lady Constance was a woman of method, Poirot continued, his tone conversational yet weighted with significance. When she prepared documents of consequence, she invariably created duplicates. This portfolio contains her personal summary of tonight's arrangements, including her private thoughts about each guest and their particular circumstances. It was to be opened tomorrow morning, Boxing Day, when she intended to take final action on several pressing matters. The implications of this revelation struck the assembled group like a physical blow. If Lady Constance had indeed prepared duplicates of her incriminating evidence, then the destruction of the dispatch box had been futile, a desperate act that had achieved nothing beyond confirming the killer's guilt. Miss Victoria's response was immediate and telling. "Surely, Monsieur Poirot, you cannot believe that Lady Constance would have kept such sensitive information in a place where it might be discovered by accident. She was far too careful, too protective of those she cared about." "Ah, but that is precisely the point, mademoiselle," Poirot replied with quiet satisfaction. Lady Constance's protective instincts were in constant conflict with her moral obligations. The portfolio contains not just evidence of crimes, but also her private struggle with the impossible choice between love and duty. It reveals the depth of her affection for someone whose actions had placed them both in an unbearable position. The detective's words struck their target with surgical precision. Miss Victoria's composure, already strained beyond its limits, began to crack visibly. Her careful mask of shocked innocence slipped, revealing glimpses of the desperate calculation that had driven her to murder. "You speak of love and duty as if they were simple concepts," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge that betrayed years of suppressed resentment. "But you understand nothing of the complexity of our relationship, nothing of the sacrifices that were demanded, nothing of the impossible standards that could never be met." Poirot nodded with apparent sympathy, though his keen eyes missed nothing of her deteriorating control. Indeed, the relationship between Lady Constance and yourself was far more complex than that of employer and secretary. She had become, in many ways, the mother you had lost, and you had become the daughter she had never had. This made her discovery of your crimes infinitely more painful for both of you. The mention of crimes caused Miss Victoria to stiffen, but Poirot continued with relentless gentleness. The embezzlement from the charity accounts, the forged signatures on important documents, the manipulation of financial records, all carried out with the skill that had made you so valuable to Lady Constance. She discovered these irregularities gradually, hoping against hope that she was mistaken, that her beloved companion could not have betrayed the trust so completely. She gave you until Boxing Day to confess and make restitution, Poirot continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She said she would pray for guidance, but you knew what her decision would be. Lady Constance never allowed personal feelings to override her principles, no matter how much it cost her emotionally. Miss Victoria's denial came with increasing desperation. "This is fantasy, Monsieur Poirot. I devoted my life to Lady Constance and her charitable works. Every penny was accounted for, every document properly authorized. You have no evidence of any wrongdoing on my part." In response, Poirot produced the small brass key he had discovered in the study fireplace, its surface bearing traces of soot and heat damage. "This is the key to Lady Constance's private safe, where she kept her most sensitive documents. Only 2 people possessed copies: Lady Constance herself and her most trusted companion. It was overlooked in your haste to destroy the evidence, hidden beneath the coals where you thought it would never be found." The sight of the key struck Miss Victoria like a physical blow. Her carefully maintained composure crumbled entirely as she realized that her most desperate gambit had failed. The evidence she had risked everything to destroy had been duplicated, preserved, waiting to condemn her despite her terrible crime. "She was going to destroy me," Miss Victoria whispered, her voice carrying years of suppressed anger and fear. "After everything I had sacrificed, all the years of devoted service, she was prepared to send me to prison for taking what I needed to survive. She spoke of love and forgiveness, but when it came to the test, her precious principles mattered more than the person who had given her everything." The confession that followed came in broken fragments, each admission torn from her like pieces of her soul. She had indeed embezzled substantial sums over several years, initially small amounts to cover personal expenses, then larger sums as her desperation grew. Lady Constance's discovery had created the impossible situation, maternal love conflicting with moral duty, that had driven Miss Victoria to the most unthinkable solution. "You used the ceremony itself as cover," Poirot concluded with quiet certainty. "The hidden light switch allowed you to plunge the chapel into darkness while remaining at your position near the altar. Lady Constance, trusting you completely, had no reason to fear your approach in the darkness. The brass poker was already positioned within reach, moved earlier during your preparations. The fatal blow was struck before she could comprehend your betrayal, and the incriminating evidence was immediately fed to the sacred brazier while the others remained disoriented." The wind outside had finally stilled, leaving the chapel in profound silence, broken only by Miss Victoria's quiet sobbing. The storm that had trapped them together was ending, but the storm of human passion and betrayal had reached its devastating conclusion. Tomorrow the authorities would arrive to find not just a murder solved, but a tragedy of love corrupted by greed and desperation, where the deepest affection had become the motive for the most unforgivable crime. In the growing stillness, Hercule Poirot prepared for the final act of his investigation, where justice would finally be served for Lady Constance, who had deserved far better than betrayal from the one person she had trusted most completely. The profound silence that followed Miss Victoria's broken confession carried more weight than any words could bear, yet Poirot observed her with the careful attention of a physician monitoring a patient whose fever had not yet fully broken. Her sobbing had subsided into the hollow breathing of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. But something in her posture suggested that the complete truth remained partially concealed behind layers of self-justification and desperate rationalization. The embezzlement, the manipulation of the lights, the destruction of evidence, Poirot said quietly, his tone carrying neither accusation nor comfort. These facts are established beyond dispute. Yet I sense there remains something more, something that troubles you even now, when confession should bring relief. His keen eyes noted how her hands continued to work nervously at her dress, a gesture that spoke of secrets still harbored, of guilt not yet fully acknowledged. Miss Victoria raised her head slowly, her tear-stained face bearing an expression of such profound anguish that even Captain Morrison, despite his military composure, shifted uncomfortably. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of suppressed torment and carefully nursed resentment. "You understand nothing of what she demanded of me," she whispered, her words directed not to Poirot, but to some invisible tribunal of judgment. "I was not merely her secretary, Monsieur Poirot. I was her confessor, her confidant, the keeper of secrets that would have destroyed half of London's most respectable families. She made me complicit in her investigations, forced me to type threatening letters, to research financial irregularities, to document every shameful detail of lives that should have remained private. The revelation struck the assembled suspects with renewed force, but Poirot pressed forward with characteristic persistence. And when the weight of these secrets became unbearable, when you began taking money to ease your own burdens, something more occurred. Did it not? Something that transformed simple embezzlement into a far more serious crime." Miss Victoria's composure cracked entirely as the final, devastating truth emerged. She had not merely stolen from the charity accounts, but had systematically blackmailed former recipients, using information gained through her privileged position to extract money from vulnerable women who had sought Lady Constance's help. The discovery of this betrayal had shattered Lady Constance's faith not just in her companion but in her own judgment, creating the internal struggle that had tormented her final days. She called it the most despicable betrayal of trust she had ever encountered, Miss Victoria said, her voice breaking with remembered humiliation. Not just theft, but the exploitation of those who had already suffered enough. She said I had corrupted everything she had worked to build, that my actions made a mockery of genuine charity. With the complete picture now revealed, Poirot turned to address the assembled group, his manner taking on the formal precision that marked his greatest revelations. Mes amis, we must now examine methodically how this tragedy unfolded, and why each of you, despite possessing compelling motives, could not have committed this particular crime. Moving with deliberate precision, Poirot directed each person to return to their exact positions during the crucial moments. "Sir Reginald," he began, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had broken so many cases before. "Your attempt on the dispatch box earlier this evening left clear evidence. The nick on your signet ring, the traces of red sealing wax on your gloves. But these very actions eliminate you as our killer. The scratches around the lock showed desperate haste, not the calculated precision that marked Lady Constance's murder. Moreover, your heavy tread during our reconstruction revealed that you could not have approached the altar silently in darkness." Dr. Carlyle's relief was palpable as Poirot continued his systematic elimination. The fatal blow was indeed precise, but it required intimacy rather than medical knowledge. The angle was lower than a tall man would naturally strike, and the absence of defensive wounds spoke to complete trust rather than surgical expertise. Your movement in darkness, mon ami, was hesitant and uncertain, not the confident approach of our killer. Captain Morrison's military bearing remained intact as Poirot acknowledged his crucial observations. Your luminous watch fixed the duration of darkness at precisely 3 minutes, and your disciplined positioning meant you remained audibly distant from the altar throughout. Most significantly, you noticed the poker's displacement before any darkness fell, evidence of premeditation by someone involved in the evening's arrangements, not a guest. Father O'Brien and Reverend Whitmore found themselves eliminated by the simple evidence of sound and movement. In our reconstruction, both of you moved noisily, colliding with furniture, betraying unfamiliarity with the chapel's precise geography. The killer's approach was silent, practiced, the movement of someone who knew every stone and shadow of this sacred space. Finally, Poirot turned to Miss Victoria, and the chapel seemed to draw a collective breath. You alone possessed every element necessary for this crime. Positioned at the writing table, you had access to the hidden electrical switch that controlled the chapel lighting, a switch you had suggested Lady Constance install for ceremonial purposes. Your intimate knowledge allowed you to plunge the chapel into darkness without leaving your station, then approach Lady Constance silently across stones you had traversed countless times in service. The technical evidence was overwhelming. The brass poker had been repositioned during Miss Victoria's preparations, placed within easy reach for the crucial moment. Lady Constance's expression of surprise rather than fear confirmed that her attacker was someone she trusted completely, someone whose presence at her side would cause no alarm. The immediate destruction of evidence in the sacred brazier, followed by the desperate burning of the dispatch box when duplicates threatened exposure, painted a picture of calculated murder followed by panicked cover-up. The burn on your thumb, the safe key found in the study fireplace, your knowledge of every mechanical detail of this abbey, all confirm what psychology had already revealed. Poirot concluded with quiet certainty. You used Lady Constance's own trust against her, approaching in darkness to strike the fatal blow before she could comprehend your betrayal. Miss Victoria's final confession came in broken fragments, each admission torn from her like pieces of her soul. She forced my hand, she insisted, her voice carrying the desperate conviction of someone who had convinced herself that murder was self-defense. She would have destroyed everything I had worked for, everything I had built. After all my devotion, all my sacrifice, she chose her precious principles over the person who had given her everything. The twisted logic of love corrupted by desperation revealed itself in its full horror. Miss Victoria had murdered not from simple greed, but from the terrible conviction that she was protecting herself from betrayal by the one person she had trusted most completely. The very depth of their relationship had made the crime possible, providing both opportunity and the psychological justification that had allowed her to cross the final, unforgivable line. Outside Whitmore Abbey, the storm had passed entirely, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to emphasize the weight of revelation within the chapel walls. Soon the authorities would arrive to find not just a murder solved, but a complex tragedy of trust betrayed, where the institutions designed to provide moral guidance had become the breeding ground for the most terrible crimes. As dawn approached and the sound of wheels on frozen gravel announced the arrival of Sergeant Davies and his men, Hercule Poirot stepped back from the circle he had drawn around their lives. The case was concluded. Justice would be served, but the victory carried the bitter taste of human failing exposed in all its complexity. Murder, at a rite of confession, was the most profane of paradoxes, yet it had followed the honest logic of the human heart, preferring one pain to another, choosing silence where words would have condemned. When he finally left Whitmore Abbey, the snow creaked beneath his measured tread, and the morning was a pale thing promising neither warmth nor absolution. At the motor car, he paused to brush a final fleck of ash from his sleeve, reflecting that it was not the tempest that raged without that most disarranged the order of human affairs, but the one that blew within the human heart itself. The storm had passed, and the world would be tidy again, for a time. The pale Yorkshire dawn cast long shadows across the chapel floor as the crunch of wheels on frozen gravel announced the arrival of Sergeant Davies and his constables. The burly sergeant entered with characteristic Yorkshire directness, his breath misting in the cold air as he surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to rural emergencies, though murder at Whitmore Abbey clearly exceeded his usual experience. "Monsieur Poirot," Davies said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority, "your message spoke of murder solved. I confess, the death of Lady Constance has shaken the entire district." Poirot rose from his position near the altar with characteristic precision, his small figure radiating quiet authority despite the early hour. "Indeed, Sergeant, the case is concluded. The murderer of Lady Constance Ashworth sits before you." He gestured toward Miss Victoria, who remained slumped in her pew, her earlier defiance replaced by the hollow exhaustion of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. As the formal procedures of arrest commenced, Captain Morrison approached Poirot with the directness that military service had ingrained in him. "Monsieur Poirot, something troubles me deeply about this night's revelations. We all possessed motives for murder. We all faced ruin from Lady Constance's investigations. What drove Miss Victoria to cross the line that the rest of us, despite our desperation, could not cross?" Poirot's response carried the measured wisdom that marked his greatest insights. "Ah, mon ami, but you misunderstand the fundamental difference. You feared exposure from a moral authority, someone who stood in judgment of your actions. Miss Victoria faced betrayal from a beloved mother figure, someone whose love had become the foundation of her very existence. The psychology is entirely different and infinitely more dangerous." Moving to the altar where Lady Constance had met her end, Poirot's keen eyes took in the scene one final time. Love, when corrupted by desperation and fear, becomes the most terrible of motives. Miss Victoria did not kill Lady Constance despite loving her, but because she loved her. The prospect of seeing disappointment and condemnation in those maternal eyes was more unbearable than the prospect of silencing them forever. Dr. Carlyle, his earlier indignation forgotten in the face of such psychological complexity, found himself drawn to this analysis. But surely the embezzlement and blackmail were crimes of simple greed, not corrupted affection. "Non, mon docteur," Poirot replied with gentle correction. Each crime followed the same psychological pattern. The initial thefts were not for luxury, but to maintain her position, to purchase the clothing and refinements that would allow her to remain worthy of Lady Constance's affection. When this proved insufficient, the blackmail of vulnerable women followed the same desperate logic. Not greed, but the terrified need to preserve the relationship that had become her entire identity. Father O'Brien, who had remained to offer final prayers for Lady Constance's soul, struggled with the theological implications. "Monsieur Poirot, in my experience, confession brings relief even when consequences follow. Why did she not trust in forgiveness rather than resort to such desperate measures?" "Because, mon père, she had convinced herself that she was protecting Lady Constance as well as herself," Poirot explained with characteristic insight. In her twisted logic, forcing Lady Constance to choose between love and duty would destroy them both. Murder seemed kinder than allowing such an impossible choice to be made. It was, in her mind, an act of mercy rather than selfishness. As Miss Victoria was led away by the constables, her dignity intact despite her circumstances, she paused at the chapel door. "She would have destroyed everything, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, her voice carrying years of suppressed anguish. "After all I had given, all I had sacrificed, her precious principles mattered more than the person who had devoted her life to serving them." Poirot regarded her with profound sadness. "Ah, mademoiselle, but that is the greatest tragedy of all. Lady Constance's private papers revealed her terrible struggle with your situation. She was torn between maternal love and moral duty, seeking a path that might preserve both. Your actions robbed her of that choice and yourself of any possibility of redemption." With the official procedures concluded and the chapel finally empty save for Poirot himself, the detective stood in contemplative silence as the morning light strengthened through the ancient windows. The storm outside had passed completely, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to emphasize the weight of human failing that would forever mark this sacred space. Preparing to take his leave, Poirot paused at the chapel entrance for one final reflection. The case was closed, justice would be served, but the victory carried no satisfaction, only the bitter recognition that human nature contained depths of self-deception that could transform devotion into betrayal and mercy into murder. As his motorcar carried him away from Whitmore Abbey, Hercule Poirot reflected that it was not the tempests of winter that posed the greatest threat to human peace, but the storms that raged within the human heart itself. The silent night for the sinful had indeed revealed sin, but of a complexity that simple confession could never have absolved. The snow continued to fall gently on the Yorkshire moors, covering the tracks of human passage, but never quite concealing the weight of tragedy that would linger in the ancient stones. In the distance, church bells began to toll for Christmas morning, their bronze voices carrying across the white landscape a message of hope and redemption that seemed, in the aftermath of such profound betrayal, both infinitely precious and heartbreakingly fragile. Hercule Poirot settled back in his seat with characteristic precision, brushing an imaginary speck from his overcoat. Another case concluded, another demonstration that the human heart remained the greatest mystery of all, capable of the deepest love and the most terrible crimes, sometimes within the same troubled soul. The little grey cells had once again illuminated the darkness, but the light they cast revealed shadows that would linger long after the investigation had passed into memory.